Hello friends, today we are going to talk about environmental problems and issues. Under this topic, we are mainly going to focus on poverty, income distribution and environment. Let me introduce you to the topic. Poverty, income distribution and environment are intimately connected. There is bidirectional causality between poverty and environment, in the sense that poverty causes environment and environment causes poverty. The exhaustion, exploitation, depletion and degradation of natural resources have resulted into impoverishment of natural wealth, which has bearing on poor, on their livelihood and income. Poor directly depend on natural resources for their food, energy, water and income. The chain goes like this. When grasslands are degraded, livestock suffer and income is lost. When woodlands and energy generation capacity is reduced, and when soil is eroded, crop productivity is reduced, and income and food sources are lost. The aim of this module is to examine the links between poverty and the environment, the effects of income distribution on economic growth, the geographic location of the poor, and some policy responses. Now friends, we will have a look at links between poverty and the environment. We will mainly focus on the mainstream view. Poverty is a painful struggle for survival. Those who are facing poverty face enormous difficulties corresponding to rapid environmental change, for they do not possess traditional knowledge base about nature and its uses. The mainstream view on the links between poverty and environmental resource degradation is that usually the planning time horizon of the poor is short and they have few options available with them. Poor are poor in health and literacy, which further reduce their ability to cope and survive. For them, only two strategies of action remains. First, they can attempt to supplement their scarce assets by intensifying their use of open access resources, which in turn may result in further resource depletion and environmental degradation. Second, they can migrate to an urban areas which would impose different pressures on natural resources and affect the circumstances in which they earn their livelihood in different ways from rural areas. In this situation, what course of action the poor takes depends on the immediate options available, cultural and institutional factors, and local and national government policies. This relationship between poverty and environment does not imply that poverty is a direct cause of environmental degradation. Rather, poverty should be seen as a disabling factor that reduces people's ability to allocate resources effectively and to respond to changes in the external environment appropriately. Often poverty is caused by rapid population growth, which results in negative effect on environment. In many developing countries, it has been seen that population growth is leading to reductions in average farm size, which is resulting in lower agricultural productivity and increased poverty. As poverty increases, the population's ability to escape environmental degradation is reduced even further. However, this is not always true. There are some studies showing that even when population grow, no corresponding environmental degradation occurred. It is because land tenure was secure, credit was available, resources were properly priced, and marketing support and infrastructure were available for agricultural and other economic activities. Let us try to understand the negative cycle that exists between poverty, population growth and environmental degradation. However, many of the negative links between poverty and the environment can be broken if certain enabling factors are put in place. They are: number 1, clarification of property rights; number 2, equitable distribution of assets; number 3, investment in education and health; number 4, local participation; number 5, use of traditional knowledge; number 6, labor intensive production. These factors enable people to use resources more efficiently. For instance, if people are better educated and encouraged to use their traditional knowledge, they will be able to get involved in productive economic activities, or if people have secure land tenure, they will be more inclined to use sustainable cultivation and or extraction methods and not mine or deplete resources and relocate when they are exhausted. The existence of poverty does not mean the environmental degradation will necessarily follow. It does not imply that poor people are responsible for the bulk of environmental degradation. Rather, it is the accumulation of wealth and the consumption patterns that follow that can be major causes of environmental degradation. Now friends, let us have a look at income distribution and growth in the developing world. Income distribution and growth play a very important role in explaining environmental degradation. Generally, in developing countries, slow growth and high inequality are seen, which leads to more degradation of environment as compared to developed countries. Inequality of income is measured by Gini index. This index is a measure of inequality. It is a ratio of low income to high income. The closer the index is to 100, the higher the level of inequality. The World Bank data of 1997 shows that in African countries, this index was between 32.0 to 56.8. In Asia, varying from 28.3 to 46.2. In Latin America, between 63.4 to 53.8, while in Europe, it was with marginal difference between 30.8 to 27.2. These survey data for different years of 90s. Recent trends in the figures for Southeast Asia show that rapid economic growth was accompanied by substantial reduction in poverty and inequality is not as high as in other developing regions. Economists have argued that this has been one of the reasons behind the economic growth in Southeast Asia. The fact is that more equitable distribution of income leads to more efficient allocation of resources and widens the base for increased consumption and investment. One example of the negative effects of a skewed or unequal distribution of income and assets is land tenure. In places with a high concentration of land ownership, as in Brazil and Colombia, production patterns tend to be capital intensive with low labor inputs, such as cattle ranching. This further diminishes the access of the poor to natural resources and exacerbates their condition. Now friends, let us have a look at the geographic location of the poor. The link between poverty and environmental degradation can be further examined by analyzing where the poor are located. A large part of the world's poor live in the following three broad kinds of areas, the bulk of which are marginalized regions. Number 1. Rural areas where agriculture is difficult because of poor soils or other biophysical characteristics, for example, sloping land, flooding and inundation. Number 2. Areas where the land's potential productivity is substantial, but the ability of the poor to use this effectively is dismissed because of their reduced access to such resources as credit, land rights and technology impacts. Number 3. Peri-urban areas where the poor are mostly confined to unhealthy and unsafe environments, for instance, open spaces along roadsides, riverbanks, steep slopes, floodplains, airport buffers, aquifers and wetlands. According to a study by Leonard in 1987, the number of poor people that live in unstable environments globally is enormous. Of the 700 million poor, 100 million live in peripheral urban areas, which in turn are often areas of high risk because of the danger of landslides and floods and poor sanitation and infrastructure. An estimated 250 million poor live in areas where agriculture could be intensified by applying fertilizers and using modern technology, and any fragility in the system could be substituted with chemical inputs. Finally, close to 350 million poor people live in areas where such substitution is either more difficult or feasible because of the climate and soil conditions. Now friends, let us have a look at environmental degradation and economic growth. The process of growth and increasing production usually demands for greater use of resources. This could be damaging to the environment in different ways. During the initial stages of growth, environmental pressure is primarily exerted on the green areas, that is, in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries and mining, where renewable or non-renewable resources are extracted. Problems with air pollution, for example, indoor pollution from stuff, and with toxic waste, for instance, dumping of obsolete pesticides, may also arise. As development progresses, increased pressures are exerted on the brown areas, including air and water pollution and the accumulation of waste products. At high income levels, countries have more resources with which to address pollution problems, and certain areas of the environment exhibit clear improvements through investments in clean technologies, more efficient production techniques, and improved infrastructure, particularly water supply and sanitation. Because of the different types of environmental problems affecting the poor, targeted policies that mitigate negative effects on green sector are necessary. Now friends, let us have a look at the policy response to poverty and the environment. The practical policy response to poverty should first aim at raising agriculture productivity in the most potentially productive areas. This will improve the well-being of some of the most impoverished poor and will reduce the pressure exerted on marginal lands. The traditional farming techniques, labor-intensive techniques, integrated post-management and modern technology input could improve agricultural productivity. After achieving this, policy should be directed toward second-generation issues like marketing and distribution channels for agricultural products that would further boost the income of poor farmers. There is another possibility that poor residing in peri-urban areas should be encouraged for urban agriculture and thereby enabling them to produce their own food. This would lead to make efficient use of underutilized urban land, also would increase the food supply for urban areas. This will help to alleviate poverty and may offset some of the dependence and environmental pressure on rural agriculture. In the areas discussed about the policy mix must include incentive scheme that consist of increase in investment, improved physical infrastructure, credit and extension information, institution building, that is, establishing or reinforcing property rights through land and resource tenure are very much needed to achieve aforesaid schemes for setting priority for this scheme-wise political decision and proper and effective institution in different time period should be taken into account. For reducing poverty and protecting environment, decentralized approach which integrates households, communities, local and national government could be an appropriate approach. This approach will lead to well-designed policy and also enable for better implementation. Now friends, we will focus on link between poverty and the environment. An alternative view emphasizes that the mainstream approach focuses on the immediate causes rather than on the key driving forces dictating the resource user's behavior. The alternative view states the widespread evidence indicates that many villages who are currently facing severe environmental degradation were actually poor in the past, yet they consciously prevented environmental degradation. Furthermore, in many areas of the world, richer groups contribute more to resource degradation than the poor. It is believed that those who think that poverty and scarcity cause degradation, which in turn promotes over extraction of natural resources, leading to greater degradation and hence even greater scarcity and poverty, are making three unjustified assumptions. Number 1, that the over extraction of natural resources is the only or preferred means of sustenance the poor people know. Number 2, that the poor are ignorant of both the limitations of their environmental resources and the consequences of their extractive practices. Number 3, that the poor have little stake in the health and productivity of their natural resources. It is believed that many poor communities have over time developed methods of sustenance based on the limitations and potential of their local natural resources base, and some evidence exists to indicate that this traditional knowledge base survives and grows even when communities have been dislocated and resettled. The key features of their adaptations were: number 1, a high dependence on the local natural resource base, leading to an explicit realization of the strong links between their sustenance and the protection and productivity of this natural resource base. Number 2, the frequent isolation of poor communities to their natural resources leads to a strong understanding of the importance, limitations and usefulness of natural resources. The communities therefore develop local technologies to protect and regenerate the resources, and making use of them, they also create a series of locally enforceable regulatory measures to monitor the intensity of resource use, for instance, social sanctions. By adopting such practices and behavior, poor communities develop a traditional system of natural resource management that helps them avoid the poverty environmental resource degradation link. However, these arrangements break down with the advent of outside advisors who design and implement external interventions at grassroots level without sufficient understanding of local realities and communities' concerns, capabilities and knowledge. Increased physical, administrative and market integration of what used to be less accessible areas with the mainstream view reduced the crucial dependence of local communities on their natural resource base. While these interventions brought with them some sort of benefits, they also created some perverse incentives that eventually led to the disintegration of community stakes in natural resources and the marginalization of the local knowledge system and institution of the local knowledge system and institutional arrangements that help to protect the natural resource base. As it is seen that the ineffectiveness of intervention directed to preventing human-induced degradation of the environment, a temptation is to rely on the traditional way of living. However, traditional measures have suffered so much transformation that their revival would likely be impossible. Hence, we should search for functional substitutes that would suit today's circumstances. The table given here lists possible ways to revive traditional method of natural resource based management along with the constraints. It is supported by evidence from successful experiences in Nepal and India in relation to point forest management. Now let us have a look at possibilities for and constraints to reviving traditional resource use system. Community stake in local natural resources, local control over natural resources, recognition and use of resource users' perspective and traditional knowledge systems. First, we will have a look at its constraints. We have formal legal, administrative and fiscal controls and restrictions creating perverse incentives, reactive mode of community behavior as individuals. Then, states resistance to self disempowerment through passing decision making power to local communities. Top down interventions with a mix of arrogance, ignorance and insensitivity toward local traditional systems. Next, we have highly depleted status of natural resource base, preventing hope and incentive to have a stake in it. Factional-ridden rural communities driven by diverse signals and concerns. Focus on forms of traditional practices rather than their rationale for use in the current context. Number 3. More heterogeneous communities with diverging individual views rather than group views on community resources. NGOs as key changing facilitating agent, often governed by own perspectives. Then, rapid disappearance of indigenous knowledge. Now friends, we will look at the possible recommendations under community stake in local natural resources, local control over natural resources, and finally, recognition and use of resource users' perspectives and traditional knowledge systems. Firstly, we have genuine local autonomy for local resource management, legal framework and support systems for natural resource users groups, genuine decentralization of decision-making powers and resources to communities, promotion of bottom-up approaches to resource management strategies using participatory method and NGO help. Secondly, resource protection investments and use of new technologies for regeneration and high productivity of the natural resource base. Then, rebuilding social capital using NGOs focus on diversified high value products from rehabilitated natural resource base. Finally, focused efforts to identify present day functional substitutes of traditional measures for resource management. Number 3. Collective stake through planned diversification shareholding system in natural resource development and gain. Then, require changes in NGOs approaches by introspection involving small local groups. Finally, research and development to incorporate rationale of traditional knowledge systems. Policymakers ought to consider these before implementing projects and advising poor communities on how they should manage their resources. The mainstream view linking poverty to natural resource degradation has some fairly convincing arguments on its side. However, policymakers should keep alternative views in mind because many are relevant to the issue of poverty environmental resource degradation links. The key point is that incorporating alternative views within mainstream practices may generate the best outcomes. So friends, let us summarize this session. The circular link between poverty, environmental degradation and poverty is complex and difficult to break. Poverty leads to unsustainable use of resources because the poor have few immediate alternative options open to them in the short run. Because they depend on natural resources for their livelihood, the degradation of these resources exacerbate their condition. Poverty is a disabling factor, not the cause of environment degradation. Hence, some other compounding issues such as population growth, poor health, illiteracy and marginalization. There are enabling factors which can help break the distractive reinforcing relationship of poverty, population growth, environmental degradation. Some of the key enabling factors are improved access to resources, clarified property rights, growth driven by labor intensive production and the integration of traditional knowledge in development. The poorest people of the world daily struggle for their existence. They live in environments that are biophysically fragile. It poses challenges to policy makers. Policy goals should focus on strengthening the enabling factors. Human capital is the most vital resource an economy has for reducing poverty, decreasing the gap between the rich and the poor, and improving resource use can have a tremendous impact in fortifying